There's a moment I still feel in my chest when the wind hits the glass just right, a sound like the whole house is holding its breath, waiting for someone to fill it. I didn't know yet that the person who would fill it was already on her way to me, carrying something I wanted more than I'd ever admitted out loud. Before I tell you how it happened, if you're new here, come join us on the channel, RP Romantic Promises. Hit like on this video, and give it a little hype to help more stories like mine find their way to you. My name is Vera, I'm 48 years old, and for most of my adult life, I built things instead of feeling them. I'm an architect, a successful one, if the magazines are to be believed, the kind of success that gets you invited to galas you don't want to attend, and profiles in journals that always describe you the same way: sharp, exacting, cold. I designed homes for other families, glass and timber structures that let in the light but kept out the noise. And somewhere along the way, I forgot to design a life for myself. My own home sits high in the mountains outside Seattle, surrounded by pine trees that don't ask questions and don't leave. It's beautiful. It's also, I'll admit now, a fortress I built one tasteful wall at a time. I was engaged once, a long time ago, to a man who told me I was easier to admire than to love. I believed him for years. After that, I stopped letting people close enough to test the theory again. I filled my days with blueprints and steel beams and client meetings, and I told myself that was enough, that I didn't need the things other people needed. But there's a particular kind of silence that settles into a house with no children's laughter in it, no small shoes by the door. And that silence has a way of finding you at 2 a.m. when you can't pretend anymore. So I made a decision the way I make every decision, methodically, with research and contracts, and a complete absence of sentiment. I wanted to be a mother. I didn't want a partner to get there. And at 48, I didn't have the patience to wait for love to arrive on its own schedule, if it ever intended to at all. I went through an agency, the kind with discreet offices and discreeter paperwork, and I told them exactly what I needed: a healthy, willing surrogate, a clean legal arrangement, and as little emotional entanglement as humanly possible. I remember saying those words to the coordinator and feeling proud of how steady my voice was. That's how Tessa came into my life, though at first she was nothing more than a name on a folder and a photograph clipped to the top of a file. 25 years old, a literature teacher from a small town outside the city. Warm brown eyes, an easy smile that looked like it had never once had to be practiced in a mirror. Everything about her file felt like the opposite of mine. Where I came from money and order, she came from modest means, and, according to her references, an almost stubborn kindness that her former employers couldn't stop mentioning. We met for the first time in a sterile little conference room downtown, lawyers on either side of us like referees expecting a fight. I remember the smell of her before I even looked up. Something soft and warm, vanilla, like a kitchen on a Sunday morning. When I finally raised my eyes to hers, she was already looking at me, not with the nervousness I expected from someone meeting a stranger who would be paying for the most intimate thing a body can offer, but with a kind of open curiosity that made me feel, for one disorienting second, completely seen. I shook it off quickly. I had a contract to discuss, clauses about prenatal care, about confidentiality, about the clean and businesslike handoff that would happen the moment the baby was born. Tessa listened to all of it with her hands folded politely in her lap, and when I finished, she asked me one question that none of my careful planning had prepared me for. She asked if I was excited. Not nervous, not prepared, excited. I didn't have an answer ready, and that unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. We signed the papers 2 weeks later. I told myself it was simple after that. A transaction. 9 months of distant logistics and monthly check-ins through an agency liaison so I wouldn't even have to see her again until it mattered. I built my life back around its usual order: work before dawn, meetings until dusk, the house quiet and exactly as I liked it. I didn't expect to think about her warm eyes or that vanilla smell as often as I did, and I certainly didn't expect to catch myself late at night, sketching the soft curve of a smile I'd only seen once. Winter crept further into the mountains. and the months passed the way they always did in my world, efficiently, without much feeling attached to them. I received updates from the agency that I read like progress reports on a construction project. The baby was healthy, the surrogate was healthy, everything was proceeding exactly according to schedule. I told myself that distance was a kindness, that keeping Tessa at arm's length protected us both from complications I had no intention of inviting into my carefully glazed and bolted life. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in early winter, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and a voice on the other end told me that Tessa's doctor had ordered immediate bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. Somewhere quiet, somewhere stable, somewhere she wouldn't be alone. I sat very still in my office, looking out at the mountains I'd spent my whole career trying to tame with glass and steel, and I understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside, that the fortress I'd built to keep everyone out was about to get its first real visitor. The day Tessa arrived, I stood at my own front door like a stranger in my own home, which tells you something about how unprepared I actually was. I'd had the guest wing prepared for weeks. The agency had seen to the practical details. Fresh linens, a crib in storage I refused to look at directly, a reading lamp I'd chosen without quite admitting to myself why I cared about the warmth of its light. But nothing in my careful preparations accounted for the moment her car pulled up the long gravel drive, snow dusting the windshield, and she stepped out wrapped in an oversized cardigan the color of oatmeal, one hand resting instinctively on the swell of her belly. She looked up at the house, all glass and dark timber rising out of the mountainside like something carved from the rock itself, and I watched her expression shift from awe to something closer to discomfort. I realized, watching her take it in, that my home looked exactly like what it was, a monument to a woman who didn't let anyone get close. Tessa caught my eye and smiled anyway, that same unpracticed smile from the conference room, and said the house was beautiful, though her voice had a slight waver to it, like she wasn't sure beautiful and welcoming were the same thing. I didn't correct her. I wasn't entirely sure myself. I showed her the guest wing, with the same brisk efficiency I used when showing clients a finished project. Here is the bathroom. Here is the kitchenette. Here is the panic button by the bed should you need anything in the night. She listened politely, nodding, her fingers trailing along the smooth concrete wall as though she were trying to find something soft in it. When I finished the tour, she asked, almost shyly, if it would be all right to put up a few things to make the room feel more like hers. I told her, of course, though something in me tightened at the thought of clutter breaking up my clean, deliberate lines. I didn't say that part out loud. Within a day, small things began to appear. A worn paperback of poetry on the nightstand. A faded quilt, clearly handmade, draped over the foot of the bed. A little dish of lavender sachets she said helped her sleep. Each object felt like a tiny act of quiet rebellion against the sterile order I'd built around myself. And I found I didn't mind it the way I expected to. I caught myself pausing in doorways longer than necessary, just looking at the way her presence had already started to soften the edges of rooms that had never been soft before. It was on the third day that Jillian called to say she was coming by, ostensibly to drop off paperwork from our last joint project, though I knew her well enough to know paperwork was rarely her only motive. Jillian and I had been business partners for over a decade before she sold her share of the firm, and in that time I'd learned that her curiosity always arrived dressed as concern. When she walked through my front door in her camel coat and her perfectly composed smile, her eyes went straight past me to where Tessa sat curled on the couch with a mug of tea, and I watched something calculating settle behind Jillian's expression. She didn't bother with introductions beyond a clipped hello, the kind reserved for hired help rather than guests. She asked Tessa, in a tone dipped in false sweetness, how it felt to be carrying someone else's child for money, whether it ever got complicated keeping her feelings out of it. I felt my spine go rigid before I even understood why. Tessa answered with grace. I wasn't sure I could have managed in her position, explaining gently that she saw it as an honor, not a transaction. But I noticed her hands tighten slightly around her mug, and that small tremor did something to me I wasn't prepared for. Jillian pressed further, commenting on the modesty of Tessa's clothing, the plainness of her car still parked in my driveway, wondering aloud whether someone from such different circumstances could really understand the world she was stepping into, even temporarily. Each word landed like a small, deliberate blow, and I felt heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with fury. Before I fully decided to speak, I heard my own voice cut through the room, sharper than I'd used with Jillian in years, telling her that Tessa was a guest in my home and would be treated with the respect that title demanded. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard in that house in a long time. Jillian blinked at me, clearly recalibrating, unused to seeing me defend anyone but myself. She recovered quickly, made some excuse about another appointment, and left not long after. But the air she'd disturbed didn't settle right away. I turned to Tessa to apologize for the intrusion, and found her watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Something between gratitude and surprise, like she hadn't expected the woman who signed contracts with such cold precision to come to her defense so fiercely. I told her I was sorry, that Jillian had no right to speak to her that way, and Tessa just shook her head softly and said it was all right, that she was used to people underestimating her. But something in the way she said it, quiet, a little tired, made my chest ache in a way I didn't have a name for yet. I excused myself shortly after, telling her I had work to finish, when really I just needed a moment alone to understand why my hands were still trembling slightly, and why the thought of anyone speaking to her like that again made something primitive and protective rise up in me that I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. That night, as I stood at my office window watching the first heavy flakes of an approaching storm drift down over the pines, the weather service issued a warning I barely registered at the time. Words like historic and prolonged scrolling across my phone screen, while my mind stayed fixed on the sound of Tessa's voice defending her own dignity in my living room. I had no way of knowing yet just how long that storm would keep us here together, how completely it would seal the two of us inside these glass walls with nothing but each other and a dying power grid standing between us and the rest of the world. The power went out just after midnight, and I remember the exact sound of it, a low hum dying somewhere deep in the walls, followed by a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I'd designed this house to feel serene in the quiet, but I'd never experienced quiet like that, total and absolute, broken only by the wind screaming against glass that suddenly felt far too thin to be trusted. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way down the hall toward the guest wing, telling myself I was simply checking on a tenant, knowing even as I thought it that the word didn't fit anymore. I found Tessa sitting up in bed, a blanket pulled around her shoulders, her eyes wide in the dark, but her voice steady when she asked if this kind of storm was normal for the mountains. I told her honestly that I'd never seen one quite this bad, and watched a flicker of fear cross her face before she pressed a hand to her belly, as if reassuring the baby more than herself. Something in that small, instinctive gesture undid a little knot of detachment in my chest. I heard myself offering, almost before I'd decided to, that she shouldn't be alone in an unheated room while we waited out the storm. We moved to the great room, where I'd already started a fire in the stone hearth, the one extravagant indulgence I'd allowed myself when designing this house, a fireplace large enough to warm the entire open floor. I brought down every blanket and pillow I owned and arranged them into something between a nest and a fortress on the floor in front of the flames. Tessa laughed softly at the sight of it, the first real laugh I'd heard from her, and said it reminded her of pillow forts from her childhood. I admitted, a little stiffly, that I'd never actually built one as a child, and she looked at me like that was the saddest thing she'd heard all week. We sat close to the fire because there was no other warm place to sit, and for a while neither of us spoke, just listened to the wind and watched the flames throw moving shadows across the glass walls. The silence between us felt different from the silence I was used to in that house. Less empty, more like two people simply breathing in the same space without needing to fill it with words. I found myself stealing glances at her profile in the firelight, the soft curve of her cheek, the way she absently rubbed slow circles over her belly. And I had to remind myself more than once that I was supposed to be the composed one in this arrangement. Eventually, she broke the quiet, asking me gently why a woman with a house this beautiful chose to fill it with so little warmth, no photographs on the walls, No clutter of a life lived loudly. I considered deflecting the way I usually did, but something about the dark and the fire and the storm sealing us in made honesty feel easier than it ever had. I told her I built things to be admired, not lived in, and that somewhere along the way, I'd convinced myself that was enough. She didn't offer pity, which I was grateful for. She just nodded slowly, like she was filing the information away with care rather than judgment. She told me a little about herself in return, about growing up in a small house full of noise and secondhand furniture and more love than money could have bought, about her mother who taught 3rd grade and read poetry aloud at the dinner table whether anyone asked her to or not. I listened more closely than I'd listened to anyone in years, drawn in by the easy warmth in her voice, the way she made a modest life sound like the richest one imaginable. I realized, somewhere in the middle of her story, that I was leaning slightly toward her without having decided to, drawn by something I didn't yet have the courage to name. At one point, the baby shifted, a visible ripple beneath her cardigan, and she laughed and reached for my hand without thinking, pressing it gently against the spot before either of us fully registered what she'd done. I felt the small, insistent movement under my palm and went completely still, something in my chest cracking open in a way I wasn't prepared for. Tessa's hand stayed over mine a moment longer than necessary, her skin warm against my suddenly cold fingers, and when our eyes met in the firelight, neither of us looked away as quickly as we should have. She pulled her hand back first, a faint flush rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's heat, and murmured an apology for being so forward. I told her there was nothing to apologize for, and meant it more than my carefully even tone let on. The air between us had shifted into something thicker, something neither of us was equipped to discuss with the storm howling just beyond the glass, so we let the silence return, gentler this time, charged with something neither of us was ready to name out loud. As the night wore on, exhaustion finally caught up with her, and she drifted off, curled into the blankets with the firelight flickering gold across her face. I stayed awake longer than I needed to, watching the slow, even rise and fall of her breathing, feeling something unfamiliar settle into my chest, equal parts terror and tenderness. I told myself it was simply the strange intimacy of survival. 2 people sharing warmth against a storm. Nothing more complicated than that. But even as I thought it, I knew I was lying to myself, because no client, no acquaintance, no carefully contracted arrangement had ever made my pulse behave the way it had at the simple weight of her hand over mine. Somewhere near dawn, with the wind still battering the windows and the power still nowhere close to returning, I noticed the small leather sketchbook I kept hidden in my desk drawer had somehow ended up beside me on the floor, as though some part of me had carried it out without fully deciding to. I hadn't opened it in front of another living soul in years, not once, not for anyone. Looking down at Tessa's sleeping face, soft and unguarded in a way mine hadn't been in decades, I felt a frightening, unfamiliar urge to finally let someone see the parts of myself I'd spent a lifetime keeping locked away behind glass. Morning came slow and gray, the storm easing into a steady, quiet snowfall instead of the violent winds from the night before. Tessa woke before I expected her to, stretching beneath the blankets with a soft sound that made my pulse stumble in a way I chose not to examine too closely. She noticed the sketchbook first, lying open on the floor beside where I'd fallen asleep sitting upright against the couch, and her eyes went to the page I'd left exposed without quite meaning to. I watched her freeze, taking in the charcoal lines of a small child's hand wrapped around an adult's finger, a drawing of a moment I'd never actually lived. I should have closed it. Every instinct I'd spent decades sharpening told me to snatch it away, to make some dismissive comment about idle doodling, and change the subject entirely. Instead, I found myself simply watching her study it, her expression soft and unreadable, while something in my chest argued loudly against my usual armor. She looked up at me slowly and asked, with a gentleness that made my throat tighten, who the hand belonged to. I told her the truth before I'd fully decided to share it. Nobody. It belonged to nobody, because it was a moment I'd imagined 1,000 times and never once gotten to keep. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just reached for the sketchbook with a silent question in her eyes, asking permission before turning the page. I nodded, and she moved through it slowly, page after page of charcoal families that didn't exist, dinner tables crowded with warmth I'd never had, small shoes by a door I'd built but never filled. Each page seemed to pull something further out of me, an old grief I'd kept so carefully contained that I'd almost convinced myself it had stopped existing. Tessa's fingers paused over a drawing of a woman reading to a child by firelight, and she looked up at me with eyes that had gone glassy with feeling. I told her, my voice rougher than I intended, that I started drawing these years ago, after the engagement ended, after I realized I'd built an entire life that looked successful from the outside and felt completely hollow from the inside. I confessed that I was terrified, plainly and simply, of being left, that somewhere underneath all the steel and glass and professional composure was a woman who'd been told once that she was easier to admire than to love, and who'd believed it ever since. Saying it out loud felt like peeling off a layer of skin I'd grown specifically to protect myself, and I braced for the pity I assumed would follow. It never came. Instead, Tessa set the sketchbook down with a care that told me she understood exactly how much it cost me to show her, and reached for my hand the way she had the night before, except this time there was no storm to blame it on, no baby kicking to explain the gesture away. She told me, with a steadiness that startled me, that the fear of being left didn't make me cold. It made me human, and that anyone who'd made me believe otherwise simply hadn't deserved the privilege of staying close enough to find out. I felt something in my chest give way entirely, a wall I'd spent 20 years reinforcing, crumbling under the weight of one quiet sentence. I asked her, almost embarrassed by how much I needed to know, how someone with so little material comfort growing up had managed to build a heart so unguarded, so willing to give warmth away freely. She smiled, a little sad around the edges, and told me that watching her mother love loudly and openly, even with empty pockets, taught her early that scarcity belonged to money, never to affection. She said she'd rather risk being hurt by loving too much than spend her life the way she suspected I had, protecting herself so thoroughly that nothing good could get in either. The words landed somewhere tender and unguarded in me, somewhere I hadn't let anyone touch in years. We sat together as the fire burned low, and she began reading aloud from the worn poetry book she'd brought from her own room, her voice soft and unhurried, occasionally pausing to rest a hand on her belly and murmur something directly to the baby between verses. I watched her, this woman who'd walked into my sterile, careful life, and immediately started rearranging it without asking permission, and felt a tenderness so sudden and overwhelming, it frightened me more than the storm outside ever had. I realized I was no longer simply watching a surrogate carry a child I'd contracted into existence. I was watching someone I was falling for, helplessly, against every rule I'd written for myself. She caught me staring at one point and asked, with that same disarming directness, what I was thinking. I almost lied. I almost reached for some clever, deflecting answer, the way I always did when conversations veered too close to anything real. Instead, I told her quietly that I hadn't expected any of this, that I'd built this entire arrangement specifically to avoid feeling something exactly like what I was feeling right now. She held my gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between us, before she looked back down at the book in her lap, a faint, knowing smile tugging at her lips. The power flickered back on sometime in the early afternoon, lights humming back to life with a suddenness that felt almost like an intrusion, breaking the spell of candlelight and confession we'd been living inside for nearly a full day. Tessa glanced around at the room slowly re-illuminating and said softly that it felt strange, going back to normal after everything that had happened in the dark. I told her I wasn't sure normal existed for either of us anymore, not after this, and watched something flicker across her face that looked dangerously close to hope. That night, after she'd retreated to her own room to rest, I sat alone by the dying fire with my sketchbook open in my lap, charcoal in hand. and found myself drawing something new for the first time in years. Not an imagined family, but Tessa exactly as she'd looked reading poetry in the firelight, one hand resting protectively over the small life growing inside her. I didn't know yet what we were becoming, or what rules I'd already begun breaking simply by letting myself feel this much. But I knew, looking down at that drawing, that whatever fragile thing had cracked open inside me during the storm wasn't closing again, no matter how hard I tried to seal it shut. It happened 3 days later, on an afternoon that had started so ordinarily, I almost missed the shift when it came. The roads had finally cleared enough for the plows to make their first pass, though we were still effectively snowed into the upper drive, and I'd settled into my office to catch up on weeks of neglected work, while Tessa rested in the great room with a stack of student essays she insisted on grading from bed, claiming idle hands made her restless. I remember feeling, for the first time in longer than I could recall, something close to contentment. The quiet rhythm of two lives orbiting comfortably around each other under one roof. Then I heard it. A small, sharp sound from down the hall. Not quite a cry, but something close enough to send my pulse spiking before my mind had even fully processed it. I was out of my chair and moving before I'd consciously decided to move, my heart slamming against my ribs in a way no client meeting or construction deadline had ever managed to provoke. I found Tessa sitting upright on the couch, one hand pressed low against her side, her face pale and her breathing shallow, papers scattered across the floor where they'd slipped from her lap. I dropped to my knees in front of her without a thought for composure, asking rapid, urgent questions. Where did it hurt? How long had it been happening? Should I call someone? She managed a small, reassuring smile through what was clearly discomfort, and told me it was just a sharp cramp. Probably nothing, the baby shifting awkwardly against a muscle that hadn't appreciated the movement, but the tremor in her voice betrayed more uncertainty than her words let on, and I felt something primal and fierce rise up in me. An instinct to protect her that overrode every careful, measured habit I'd spent my whole life cultivating. I called her doctor immediately, my hand steadier on the phone than I expected, given how hard my heart was pounding, and relayed her symptoms with a precision that surprised even me. The nurse on the line talked me through what to watch for, reassured me it sounded like normal round ligament pain, common in the 3rd trimester, nothing requiring an emergency trip through icy roads, but to call back if anything changed. I hung up and turned back to Tessa, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place, something between gratitude and quiet astonishment, as if she hadn't expected this particular version of me to exist. I helped her shift into a more comfortable position, propping pillows beneath her back and her knees the way the nurse had instructed, my hands moving with a careful, deliberate gentleness I didn't know I still possessed. As I adjusted the blanket around her, I caught the scent of her properly for the first time in days. Vanilla warmed by her skin, mixed with something faintly floral from the lavender she kept by her bed. It hit me low and unexpected, settling somewhere just beneath my ribs, and I had to remind myself to breathe normally as I finished tucking the blanket around her. She reached out and caught my wrist gently as I started to pull away, her thumb brushing lightly over the inside of my forearm, and thanked me. Her voice softer now, that the worst of the discomfort had passed. I told her there was nothing to thank me for, that of course I would make sure she and the baby were safe. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they didn't fully capture what had just moved through me. The sheer, overwhelming force of needing her to be all right. Her fingers stayed wrapped loosely around my wrist a moment longer than necessary, and neither of us moved to break the contact. I sat down on the edge of the couch beside her, closer than strict professionalism would have allowed, and found myself smoothing a few loose strands of hair back from her forehead before I'd fully registered the intimacy of the gesture. She leaned, almost imperceptibly, into my palm, her eyes drifting half-closed, and the small, trusting motion undid something in me completely. My heart was beating so hard I was certain she could feel it in the air between us, an unfamiliar, reckless rhythm that had nothing to do with fear anymore, and everything to do with how close her mouth was to mine. We stayed like that for a long, suspended moment, her cheek resting lightly against my hand, my fingers still tangled gently in her hair, the quiet hum of the house, the only sound besides our breathing. I was acutely aware of every point where we touched, the warmth of her skin, the soft rise and fall of her chest settling back into a calmer rhythm, the faint trace of her perfume still wrapped around me like something I never wanted to wash off. I told myself this was simply comfort, simply care, the natural aftermath of fear finally easing its grip. I didn't believe a word of it. Eventually, she opened her eyes fully and looked up at me, and whatever she saw on my face made her breath catch softly, audibly, in the quiet room. I knew I should pull back, should re-establish the careful distance I'd built this entire arrangement around. But I found I couldn't make myself move, couldn't make myself want to. For one long, dangerous heartbeat, I let myself simply exist in that closeness, feeling her warmth, feeling my own pulse hammering somewhere in my throat, feeling the terrifying, exhilarating realization that I'd already crossed a line I had no intention of walking back from. It was Tessa who finally broke the moment, gently, with a soft laugh that was equal parts nervous and amused, saying she should probably finish grading those essays before she fell completely asleep on me. I stood quickly, putting careful distance between us under the guise of fetching her a glass of water, my hands not quite as steady as I would have liked. But as I stood at the kitchen sink, watching the water run, catching my own reflection faintly in the dark window beyond it, I understood with sudden, unwelcome clarity that whatever I was feeling for her had stopped being something I could quietly manage from a safe, professional distance. It had grown into something with its own pulse now, and it was beating louder every single day. That evening, with the power still flickering on and off in stubborn protest against the lingering storm damage, I suggested we eat dinner by the fire again, rather than risk the dining room going dark mid-meal. Tessa agreed easily, settling onto the thick rug with the same blankets from our first storm-bound night, while I carried in a simple meal I'd thrown together, soup and warm bread. Nothing elaborate, though I found myself oddly nervous arranging it, as if presentation mattered more than it ever had before. The flames cast everything in low amber light, softening the sharp lines of the room I'd designed so deliberately, and softening something in me as well. We ate slowly, talking about nothing important. Her favorite poems, my early sketches for this very house, the particular stubbornness of cedar when you tried to bend it into curves it didn't want to take. It should have felt easy, comfortable, the way our conversations had started to feel over the past week. Instead, I was aware of every small movement she made, the way firelight caught gold in her eyes, the way her cardigan slipped slightly off one shoulder, and I found my carefully maintained composure slipping right along with it. At one point, she reached for the bread at the same moment I did, and our hands brushed, nothing more than that. A brief accidental contact that lasted perhaps half a second. But I felt it travel up my arm like something deliberate, something charged, and when I glanced up, I caught her watching me with an expression that told me she'd felt it too. Neither of us said anything. We both simply withdrew our hands a little too quickly, returning to conversation that suddenly felt thinner, more careful, like we were both navigating around something neither of us was ready to name directly. I excused myself shortly after to add another log to the fire, grateful for the small task, the brief physical distance it allowed me. Crouched there at the hearth, I let myself finally acknowledge, fully and without the usual deflection, exactly what was happening to me. I was falling for the woman carrying my child, the woman I'd hired through careful legal channels, specifically to keep my heart entirely out of this arrangement. The realization landed in my chest with the weight of something both terrifying and, infuriatingly, undeniable. I thought about the contract sitting in my desk drawer upstairs, every clause I'd insisted on, the language about professional distance, about clear boundaries, about an arrangement that would end cleanly the moment the baby was born. I'd written those terms myself, certain they'd protect me from exactly this. Sitting there by the fire, watching Tessa's shadow flicker against the glass wall behind her, I understood with sudden clarity how foolish that certainty had been. You can build all the careful walls you want. They don't account for someone who walks in and starts dismantling them gently, one kindness at a time, without even trying. When I returned to the rug, Tessa was quiet, watching the flames with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something thoughtful, maybe a little uncertain. She asked, without looking at me directly, whether I thought it was strange, the two of us growing close like this, given everything the contract was supposed to keep separate. I felt my chest tighten at the question, because it was exactly the thing I'd been avoiding saying out loud myself. I told her carefully that I didn't know what to call what was happening between us, but that calling it strange felt like the wrong word for something that felt, despite everything, remarkably right. She looked up at me then, really looked, and the vulnerability in her expression mirrored something I rarely allowed myself to show anyone. She admitted quietly that she hadn't expected to feel anything beyond professional warmth for the woman who'd hired her, that she'd built her own careful boundaries going into this arrangement. Boundaries that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with protecting her own heart from getting tangled up in something temporary. Hearing her say it, hearing that she'd been fighting the exact same battle I had, made the ache in my chest somehow both worse and strangely comforting. I told her, my voice lower than I intended, that I was scared, plainly and simply, of wanting something I had no right to want from her, of confusing gratitude or proximity, or simple loneliness for something deeper that might not survive outside the strange, isolated bubble this storm had created. She was quiet for a long moment, her hand drifting absently to rest over her belly, before she said softly that she didn't think what she was feeling had anything to do with the storm, or the isolation, or even the arrangement that had brought us together in the first place. She said it felt like something that would have found her regardless, storm or no storm, contract or no contract. The fire crackled between us, throwing shifting light across both our faces, and the air in the room felt thick with everything neither of us had said outright yet. I wanted, more than I'd wanted almost anything in years, to close the distance between us, to find out what her mouth tasted like, whether it was as warm as everything else about her seemed to be. But I held myself back, gripped by the old familiar fear that had governed every relationship I'd ever let slip through my fingers. The fear that reaching for something good would only guarantee its eventual loss. So instead, I simply held her gaze, letting the unspoken thing between us sit there, undefined and trembling, refusing yet to become real. Eventually, she broke the silence first, saying softly that it was getting late, that she should try to sleep while the baby seemed calm. I nodded, helping her up from the rug with hands that lingered a half-second longer than necessary at her waist, at her elbow, anywhere I could touch her under the easy excuse of assistance. As she paused at the threshold of the hallway, glancing back at me with firelight still dancing faintly behind her, I felt the full, dizzying weight of everything I'd been holding back, pressing hard against my chest. I knew, watching her disappear down the hall, that whatever fragile restraint had kept us apart tonight wouldn't hold much longer. Something was coming. I could feel it building between us like pressure before a storm, and I had no idea anymore whether I had the strength, or even the desire, to keep stopping it. I didn't sleep much that night, lying awake listening to the wind finally dying down outside, replaying the way Tessa's eyes had held mine before she disappeared down the hall. By morning, the silence in the house felt different, charged, like the entire structure was holding its breath alongside me. I found her in the kitchen, wrapped in that same oatmeal cardigan, watching steam curl up from a mug of tea cradled between her hands. And when she looked up at me, neither of us bothered pretending the night before hadn't happened. We didn't talk much that day. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding settling between us, something neither of us had the courage yet to name, but both of us could feel humming beneath every small interaction. Every brushed hand, every lingering glance held a beat too long. I caught myself watching her throughout the afternoon with an intensity that would have embarrassed me a month earlier, and more than once I caught her watching me right back, a soft flush rising in her cheeks before she looked away. That evening, the road still too treacherous to risk, and the agency liaison having quietly extended her stay another week given the doctor's continued caution, we found ourselves back by the fire, the place that had become, without either of us deciding it, the true center of this house. Tessa sat close to me this time. No careful gap of cushions between us, her shoulder nearly brushing mine as she told me about a student of hers who'd written the most heartbreaking poem about loneliness, without realizing it was about himself. I listened, but I was only half hearing the words, entirely consumed by her nearness, by the warmth radiating off her skin. She paused mid-sentence, noticing I'd gone quiet, and turned to look at me directly. Whatever she saw on my face made her own breath catch softly. I should have looked away. I should have reached for some safe, deflecting comment the way I always did when things threatened to become too real. Instead, I found myself reaching out and gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, my fingers trailing lightly along her jaw afterward, unable to stop myself, unwilling to even try. Her eyes fluttered closed for just a moment at the touch, and when she opened them again, something had shifted, settled, decided. She lifted her hand slowly and pressed it against my cheek, her palm warm against my skin, and told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she was tired of fighting something that felt this honest. She said she didn't care anymore about contracts or boundaries, or what either of us was supposed to feel. She only knew what she actually felt, sitting here with me, and she was done pretending otherwise. I turned my face slightly into her palm, unable to help it, and felt something inside me finally, completely surrender. I told her, my voice rough with everything I'd been holding back for weeks, that I felt it too, that I'd been terrified of exactly this, of wanting something so much I couldn't survive losing it. She shook her head softly, her thumb tracing gently along my cheekbone, and told me she wasn't going anywhere, not unless I sent her away myself. That was all it took. I closed the small distance between us slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, but she only leaned into it, meeting me halfway with a softness that undid every careful wall I'd built over 20 years in a single, gentle motion. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, both of us testing the fragile new ground beneath our feet, her lips warm and unhurried against mine. Then her fingers curled into the front of my sweater, pulling me closer, and the careful hesitation melted into something deeper, something neither of us seemed willing to interrupt. I cupped her face in both hands, feeling the soft warmth of her skin under my palms, breathing in that familiar scent of vanilla and lavender that had been quietly undoing me for weeks. She made a small, soft sound against my mouth that I felt everywhere at once, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that I had never in my life been kissed like this, like something precious being discovered rather than simply taken. Time seemed to fold in on itself, the fire crackling somewhere distant, the storm outside finally forgotten entirely. When we finally drew apart, breathless and trembling slightly, she rested her forehead against mine, her hand still curled gently at my collar, and let out a soft, shaky laugh that sounded like relief-given sound. I pulled her carefully into my arms instead, her back against my chest, both of us watching the dying fire in a silence that no longer felt like distance, but like the deepest closeness I'd ever allowed myself to feel. Whatever came next, contracts and consequences in the world waiting just beyond this storm, I knew with quiet, frightening certainty that I would never be able to go back to who I was before that kiss, and some small healing part of me didn't want to. I woke before dawn, alone in my own bed, having finally pulled myself away from the fire and that warm tangle of blankets sometime past midnight, telling myself I needed space to think. I lay there in the gray pre-morning light, staring at the ceiling, and felt the panic arrive exactly the way it always did, quiet at first, then suffocating. I had let someone all the way in. I had handed her every fragile, hidden piece of myself, my sketchbook, my fears, my mouth against hers in front of a dying fire, and now I lay there calculating, with cold, mechanical precision, every possible way this could end in exactly the kind of loss I'd spent 2 decades building walls against. By the time the sun came up, I'd convinced myself I'd made a catastrophic error. I told myself the isolation had distorted things, That the storm and the fire and the strange suspended bubble of being cut off from the world had manufactured feelings that wouldn't survive contact with reality. I told myself Tessa was 25, carrying a child for money, vulnerable in ways I'd taken advantage of without meaning to, and that the kindest thing I could do now was retreat, before either of us got hurt any worse than we already might be. By the time I heard her moving in the kitchen, I had my armor back on, every buckle fastened tight. I came downstairs dressed for work, though there was nowhere to go with the road still half buried, and greeted her with a clipped professional good morning that landed in the warm kitchen like a glass of ice water. I watched her face fall slightly, confusion flickering behind her eyes as she searched my expression for some explanation. I gave her none. I poured my coffee with brisk efficiency, mentioned something about needing to catch up on emails, and retreated to my office before she could ask the question I could see forming on her lips. I spent the morning hiding behind work that didn't actually need doing, rereading the same paragraph of an email 3 times without absorbing a single word. Every time I heard her moving through the house, soft footsteps, the quiet clink of dishes, I felt my chest tighten with a confusing mixture of longing and dread. I told myself this was protecting both of us. I told myself it was the responsible thing, the contractually appropriate thing, even as some smaller, more honest part of me recognized it for exactly what it was: fear, wearing the costume of discipline. She knocked on my office door around midday, holding a plate of food she said I'd forgotten to eat, and I thanked her with the same careful, distant politeness I might have used with a contractor delivering supplies. I watched something harden slightly in her own expression, a wariness replacing the openness that had been there just hours before. She asked quietly if everything was all right, if she'd done something wrong. And I told her, in a voice that sounded foreign even to my own ears, that nothing was wrong, that I simply had a great deal of work to catch up on after the storm. It was a lie so transparent I almost couldn't say it without flinching, and I saw in her eyes that she knew it too. She set the plate down on my desk without another word and left, closing the door behind her with a gentleness that somehow felt worse than if she'd slammed it. I sat there afterward staring at the food going cold, my hands pressed flat against the desk to keep them from shaking, hating myself with an intensity I hadn't felt since the days right after my engagement ended, when I'd first decided that loving anyone openly simply wasn't worth the risk. The rest of the day passed in the same brittle silence, the two of us orbiting each other through the house like strangers, every interaction stripped down to bare necessity. I caught her once, standing at the great room window watching the snow, her arms wrapped around herself in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside, and felt something twist sharply in my chest. I almost crossed the room to her. I almost let every careful defensive instinct fall away again the way it had by the fire. Instead, I turned and walked back to my office, telling myself it was for the best. That distance now would spare us both something worse later. By evening, the warmth that had filled this house for the past week had drained out of it entirely, replaced by the same cold, polished silence I'd lived inside for years before she arrived. I ate dinner alone at my desk instead of joining her by the fire, and the absence of her laugh, her voice reading poetry, her hand finding mine without thinking, felt like a physical ache lodged somewhere beneath my ribs. I told myself this was simply returning to normal. I knew, even as I thought it, that normal had stopped existing the moment she'd walked through my front door. Late that night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing outside her door, my hand raised to knock, before I lost my nerve entirely and let it fall back to my side. Through the door, I could hear nothing, just silence, and I wondered with a fresh stab of guilt whether she was lying awake too, hurt and confused by the sudden coldness I'd wrapped myself back in without explanation. I told myself I would explain everything in the morning, that I simply needed tonight to gather myself, to find the right careful words to undo the damage I'd caused. I didn't yet understand that careful words were exactly the problem, that Tessa had never once asked me to be careful with her. I returned to my own room and lay awake long into the night, staring at the dark ceiling, replaying the warmth of that kiss against the cold, deliberate cruelty of how I'd treated her today. I told myself I was protecting us both from a heartbreak I considered inevitable. But underneath that justification, quieter and more honest, was a darker fear I wasn't ready to face yet. The fear that I had already hurt her. Badly. Exactly the way every other important relationship in my life had eventually hurt someone, and that tomorrow she might finally decide I wasn't worth the trouble of waiting out. Tessa found me the next morning before I'd even managed to pour my first cup of coffee, standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that told me she wasn't going to let me hide behind work emails again. She asked me directly, without any of the softness she usually wrapped her words in, what exactly I thought I was doing, treating her like a stranger after everything that had passed between us by that fire. I opened my mouth to offer some careful, deflecting answer, and found, for once, that the words simply wouldn't come. She told me she understood fear, that she'd grown up watching her own mother flinch away from good things out of habit, certain that nothing kind ever lasted. But she said she refused to let me do to her what fear had done to me for 20 years. Refused to be pushed away simply because I'd gotten scared of how much I felt. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, not from weakness, but from the effort of holding back tears she clearly didn't want to shed in front of me. And watching her fight so hard to stay composed broke something open in my chest all over again. I felt cornered, exposed in a way I hadn't been in years, and instead of reaching for honesty the way I should have, I reached for the only weapon I'd ever fully trusted: money. I told her, my voice far steadier than I actually felt, that perhaps it would be cleaner for both of us if she considered an early departure once the baby arrived. That I would, of course, compensate her generously for any inconvenience, more than generously. I heard myself say the number out loud, an obscene amount meant to smooth over a mess I'd created, and watched her face change in real time as the words landed. For a moment, she simply stared at me, and I watched something in her expression crack wide open, hurt giving way rapidly to anger. She asked me, her voice low and trembling, whether I actually believed she could be bought off that easily, whether everything she'd shown me, every honest, unguarded piece of herself she'd handed over freely, had somehow translated in my mind into a price tag I could simply increase until the problem went away. I tried to explain, tried to say it wasn't like that, but the words felt hollow even to me, because some ugly, frightened part of me had absolutely hoped exactly that. She crossed the kitchen toward me, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to hold them back, and told me fiercely that she didn't want my money, that she had never once cared about my money. Not from the conference room with the lawyers all the way through every quiet night we'd spent by that fire. She said the only thing she'd ever wanted from me was honesty. The same honesty I'd shown her with that sketchbook. The same honesty she'd felt in that kiss. And that watching me try to buy my way out of feeling something real was the single most insulting thing anyone had ever done to her. I stood there frozen, the check still half formed in my mind, watching this woman who had nothing in material terms compared to me stand taller and more certain than I'd managed to feel in years. She wiped angrily at her tears and told me that she loved me, plainly, devastatingly, the words landing in that kitchen like something irreversible, and that she would rather walk away with nothing and a broken heart than stay one more day being treated like a transaction by someone too afraid to admit she felt the exact same thing. Something in me, finally, completely shattered at those words. Every careful wall, every contract clause, every cold instinct I'd relied on for 2 decades crumbled at once, and I felt the full, terrifying weight of how badly I'd hurt her crash over me like cold water. I reached for her, my hands trembling, and told her, my own voice breaking now, that she was right, that I'd been a coward, that I'd tried to buy distance because distance had always been the only thing that ever felt safe to me, and that I was more sorry than I had words to properly say. She didn't pull away from my reaching hands, but she didn't fully soften either, watching me with wary, red-rimmed eyes, waiting to see if this was just another careful performance or something real. I told her I didn't want her to leave, not after the baby came, Not ever. That the thought of this house going back to the cold, silent place it had been before she arrived made something in my chest physically ache. I told her I loved her too, that I'd been too terrified to say it until the alternative, losing her entirely, became more unbearable than the fear itself. The kitchen fell silent, except for both of us breathing unsteadily, the abandoned coffee growing cold on the counter, the check I'd never actually written sitting unspoken and humiliating in the air between us. Tessa searched my face for a long moment, and I let her, refusing this time to hide behind composure or distance or any of the old armor I'd worn for so long it had nearly become my actual skin. Whatever she decided in that moment, whether she chose to forgive the damage I'd caused or simply walk away with the dignity I hadn't given her enough credit for, I understood that I had finally, truly run out of places left to hide. Tessa didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that I felt my heart climbing into my throat, certain I'd already lost something I'd only just found the courage to claim. Then she let out a slow, shaky breath, and the wariness in her eyes softened into something closer to exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too much hurt for too many hours. She asked me quietly if I meant it, the part where I said I loved her, or if that too was something I'd reach for and then retract the moment the fear came creeping back in. I understood, hearing the question, exactly how much damage one cold morning had done. I crossed the rest of the distance between us and took her hands in mine, holding on like she might disappear if I let go, and told her I meant every word, that I was done letting fear write the script for my entire life. I told her about the engagement that ended badly, about the years afterward where I'd convinced myself that being admired from a safe distance was a perfectly acceptable substitute for being loved up close. I told her that for the first time in 2 decades, I wanted the messy, terrifying, up-close version, even though I had absolutely no practice at it and would probably get it wrong more than once trying to learn. Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears felt different, softer, less like grief and more like relief finally given permission to surface. She said she didn't need me to be perfect at this, that she'd never expected perfect, only honest, and that this, right here, finally felt like honesty instead of performance. I felt my own eyes sting unexpectedly, something I hadn't allowed myself in years, and didn't bother hiding it from her, letting her see exactly how undone she'd made me. I told her I was sorry, again and again. Not because the words were enough, but because I needed her to know how completely I meant them. She reached up slowly and brushed a tear from my cheek with her thumb, the same gentle gesture she'd used the night of our first kiss, and told me softly that she forgave me, that she understood fear didn't disappear overnight just because someone decided to be brave once. She said what mattered now was that I kept choosing her, kept choosing honesty, even when the old instinct to retreat came creeping back, because it would, and she needed to know I wouldn't run from it again the way I had 2 mornings ago. I promised her, with a certainty that surprised even me, that I would choose her every single time, for as long as she'd let me. The space between us had closed entirely without either of us quite noticing, and when she tilted her face up toward mine, I didn't hesitate this time, didn't let fear or contracts or 20 years of careful distance get in the way. The second kiss was nothing like the first, tentative and discovering. This one was certain, steady, both of us fully present and fully choosing it. Her hands coming up to rest against my chest as though she could feel exactly how hard my heart was working beneath her palms. I held her face gently in both hands, kissing her slowly, deliberately, pouring every apology and every promise I had into it. When we finally drew back, both of us a little breathless, she rested her head against my shoulder with a soft, contented sigh, and I wrapped my arms around her fully for the first time, without an ounce of hesitation holding me back. We stood like that in the kitchen for a long while, the cold coffee forgotten, the morning light slowly warming the glass walls around us, and I felt something settle deep in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I could remember. A quiet, steady peace that had nothing to do with control or composure, and everything to do with simply being known. Later that evening, we moved to the couch in the great room, the fire low and steady, and Tessa curled into my side with an ease that told me she trusted this version of me, the one without armor, more than she'd ever trusted the careful, polished version I'd presented at the start. We talked quietly about small things, names for the baby she'd been considering, the kind of nursery she pictured, and I found myself, for the first time, actually picturing it too. Not as a contracted obligation, but as a future I genuinely wanted to be part of in every sense of the word. At some point, the conversation slowed into comfortable silence, and I felt her breathing even out against my chest, the soft, steady weight of her settling fully into sleep. I sat there in the firelight a while longer, simply listening, her heartbeat faint but steady beneath my palm. The baby's occasional small movements, a quiet reminder of everything still ahead of us. I thought about the woman I'd been just 2 days earlier, offering checks to buy my way out of feeling something real, and felt a kind of grateful disbelief that she'd given me the chance to become someone better than that. Eventually, I let myself drift off too, my arms still wrapped around her, the fire burning low and golden against the dark glass walls. The storm long since passed, and the house finally, truly warm, in a way no fireplace alone could have managed. I didn't dream that night, or if I did, I don't remember it. Only the deep, dreamless rest of someone who had finally stopped bracing for the next loss. I woke once near dawn to find her still curled against me, her hand resting protectively over her belly even in sleep, and felt a peace so complete, it almost frightened me, right up until I remembered I no longer had any reason left to be afraid of it. The peace lasted exactly 4 more days. 4 days I would later think of as the gentlest stretch of my entire life, full of slow mornings and easy laughter, and a closeness I'd spent 2 decades convinced I wasn't built for. We fell into a rhythm that felt less like an arrangement now, and more like something close to a life. Tessa teaching me the names of constellations from a book she'd found on my shelf, me teaching her to sketch simple shapes by the fire, both of us pretending, just a little, that the due date circled on the calendar wasn't drawing steadily closer. It happened on a Thursday evening, ordinary in every way until suddenly it wasn't. Tessa had been quiet for most of dinner, shifting uncomfortably in her seat, and I just started to ask if she needed anything when she went very still, her eyes widening, one hand flying to grip the edge of the table. She looked up at me and said, in a voice gone tight and careful, that her water had just broken, and for one suspended second, the entire kitchen seemed to tilt sideways around me, every ounce of composure I'd ever possessed evaporating instantly. I forced myself to move, grabbing the hospital bag we'd packed and left waiting by the door for exactly this moment, helping her into her coat with hands that wanted to shake but didn't dare. Outside, the temperature had dropped hard after sunset, and the long mountain road down from the house glistened under the porch light with a thin, treacherous sheen of black ice, the kind that doesn't announce itself until tires are already sliding across it. I felt fear claw up the back of my throat, sharper than anything I'd felt in that entire storm, because this time the stakes weren't abstract at all. I got her settled into the passenger seat, reclined slightly the way the nurse on the phone had instructed, and pulled out onto that dark, glittering road with my hands locked tight around the wheel. Tessa was breathing hard beside me, her face tight with the building intensity of contractions now coming closer together than either of us liked, and every few seconds her hand found mine across the console, gripping hard enough to leave marks. I kept my eyes fixed on the narrow beam of the headlights, navigating curves I'd driven 1,000 times before, and had never once found this terrifying. About halfway down the mountain, the back tires slid sideways on a patch of ice, the whole car drifting toward the guardrail before I managed to ease us back into the lane, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. Tessa let out a small, frightened sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper, and I reached over without thinking, gripping her hand tighter, telling her in the steadiest voice I could manage that I had her, that I wasn't going to let anything happen to either of them. Not tonight, not ever. I'm not sure I'd ever meant anything more completely in my entire life. She squeezed my hand through another contraction, her breathing ragged, and I kept talking, filling the dark, frightening silence of that icy road. with anything I could think of to keep her calm and conscious, to keep her with me. I told her about the nursery we'd started planning, the soft yellow paint she'd chosen, the second-hand rocking chair she'd insisted on, instead of something new, because it reminded her of her mother's. I told her I loved her, again and again, the words coming easier now than I'd ever imagined they could. A steady, unbroken promise I repeated like a lifeline thrown across the dark. She managed a weak, breathless laugh between contractions and told me I was babbling, and I admitted, with a shakiness in my own voice I made no attempt to hide, that I was terrified, more terrified than I'd ever let myself be about anything, because I finally had something worth losing, and the entire universe seemed determined to test exactly how badly I wanted to keep it. She turned her head toward me despite the pain and told me fiercely that we weren't losing anything tonight, that she intended to hold me to every single promise I'd just made her on this road. And something about her certainty steadied my own shaking hands on the wheel. The final stretch of mountain road eventually gave way to the cleared, salted streets of the city, and I felt a sob of pure relief catch in my throat at the sight of streetlights ahead, civilization, safety, the hospital's glowing sign visible just a few blocks further. Tessa's contractions were coming hard and fast now, barely a minute apart, her hand white-knuckled around mine, and I pressed down on the accelerator with a desperate urgency, whispering that we were almost there, that she just needed to hold on a little longer, that I wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever. I pulled up to the emergency entrance in a screech of tires, barely remembering to put the car in park before I was out and around to her side, calling for help, my voice cracking with an emotion I didn't bother trying to control anymore. Nurses appeared with a wheelchair, moving with the brisk efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times. And as they helped Tessa out of the car, she reached back for my hand one last time, her eyes finding mine through the chaos of the bright entrance lights. I held on, walking beside the wheelchair as they rushed her inside, repeating the only promise that mattered anymore, that I was right here, and I wasn't letting go. The hours that followed blurred together in a way I still can't fully untangle. Fluorescent lights and hushed voices, and the steady, rhythmic beeping of machines monitoring 2 heartbeats that had become, somewhere along the way, the only 2 heartbeats in the world that mattered to me. They let me stay, pressed into a corner of the delivery room in scrubs a nurse had handed me without asking questions, holding Tessa's hand through every contraction, every exhausted push, every moment where her grip on my fingers became the only steady thing in a room spinning with urgency. I watched her find strength I hadn't known a person could hold, watched her face twist with effort and pain, and a fierce, unshakable determination that humbled me completely. I kept my forehead pressed close to hers between contractions, repeating the same quiet words I'd used on that icy road, that I was right here, that she was doing beautifully, that we were almost there. She gripped my hand hard enough to bruise during the final push, and I didn't care at all. Didn't feel anything except the desperate, hopeful ache of waiting for the sound that would change both our lives forever. When it finally came, it filled the entire room. A thin, furious, beautiful cry that cut straight through every fear I'd carried up that mountain road and broke something open in my chest all at once. I watched the doctor lift our daughter into the light, small and red-faced and impossibly perfect, and felt tears spill down my face without any attempt to stop them. 20 years of careful composure dissolving completely in the space of a single sound. Tessa let out a sob that was equal parts exhaustion and pure joy, reaching for her immediately, and I stood frozen for one long, suspended heartbeat, simply staring at the impossible, fragile miracle of it. They placed the baby gently on Tessa's chest, and I moved closer, my hand finding Tessa's shoulder, both of us leaning over this tiny, squalling creature who had somehow, through every contract clause and careful boundary I'd once insisted on, become the most important thing either of us had ever helped create. Tessa looked up at me through happy tears and asked if I wanted to hold her, and I nodded, my own hands trembling as the nurse helped settle our daughter into my arms for the first time. She quieted almost instantly against my chest, and something in me quieted right along with her. 20 years of careful, guarded solitude finally, completely at rest. We named her Junie, after Tessa's grandmother, a name that felt warm and unpretentious in a way that suited the life we were building far better than anything from my own polished world ever could have. The days that followed blurred into soft, sleepless weeks back at the house. Exhaustion and diapers and Tessa's gentle laughter filling rooms that had once known only silence. I watched the nursery she'd designed slowly come to life exactly as she'd pictured it, soft yellow walls and that second-hand rocking chair, and felt a contentment so foreign and so complete that I sometimes simply stood in the doorway, watching, afraid to disturb how perfectly right it all felt. Spring arrived in the mountains the way it always did, slow and reluctant, snow retreating in patches to reveal the dark, waiting earth beneath, and the glass walls of my once cold house filled with a new kind of light I'd never quite seen in them before. Tessa stayed, of course, not as a surrogate fulfilling a contract long since rendered meaningless, but as the woman I loved, the partner I'd never let myself imagine I deserved, raising our daughter together in a home finally worthy of the word. Jillian called once, sharp and curious as ever, and I simply told her I was happy, a sentence so foreign in my own mouth that I had to repeat it to fully believe it myself. I still keep the sketchbook, though it lives openly on the coffee table now instead of locked away in a drawer, filled with new drawings that no longer need to be imagined because they're simply moments I get to live. Tessa reading poetry to Junie by the fire, small shoes finally, truly by the door. Some evenings I catch myself standing at the same window where I once watched a storm roll in and changed everything, watching instead the sunset stretch gold and pink across the pines, Tessa's laughter drifting in from the next room, and I think about the woman I used to be, the one who believed glass walls and careful distance were the safest way to live. She wasn't wrong that they kept her safe. She was wrong about everything else, about what safety was actually worth, about what a life built entirely to avoid loss eventually costs a person in warmth, in connection, in every small, ordinary joy I'd denied myself for 20 years. I think about her sometimes, that frightened, guarded architect, with more compassion than I ever expected to feel for myself, because she didn't know yet what I know now, that the bravest thing a person can do isn't building walls strong enough to keep pain out. It's tearing them down anyway, and trusting that what walks in will be worth every bit of the risk. If our story moved you even a little, I'd love for you to stick around. Come find us on RP Romantic Promises, hit that like button, and give this video some hype so more stories like Tessa's and mine can keep finding their way to people who need them. Thank you for sitting with us through every part of this journey, and I hope, wherever you are tonight, that you find your own glass house and someone worth letting all the way in.